We sometimes view Paul's struggles as physical. He gets beaten up a lot, as we're going to see. But I think you're going to see that there are emotional struggles, there are spiritual struggles, there are struggles with doubt and discouragement that I'm going to argue weigh on him every bit as heavily. So if you're sitting there and you say, you know, I'm healthy. I haven't been to the doctor in 5 years. I feel great. That doesn't mean you're without struggle. Doesn't mean there's not a weight that rests on you that Paul would love to have lifted through the gospel and through the grace of God. So I just don't want you to hear the extreme challenges that Paul faced as some sort of a rebuke, some sort of your suffering doesn't count. He would never want it heard that way. He would want it heard as if God can deliver him, he can deliver you as well. So that's a word of caution, a word of clarification. Throughout this letter, Paul uses mainly first-person plural pronouns. In other words, he says we, our, ourselves. In chapter 1, verse 1, he says this letter is from Paul and Timothy. Now, why is that important to note? I think it's important because sometimes we see Paul as some sort of ancient superhero. He belongs in Marvel Comics. He's got powers we don't have. Hit him as hard as you want, he just gets right back up again. To the degree that you see him that way, his example becomes less relevant. His sympathy becomes less relevant because he doesn't feel what you feel. He's got powers you don't have. As wrong as that is, as wrong as that view is, I think it is the view that kind of lurks in the back of our minds sometimes when we look at this man. He's like Superman. Kind of on the outside, he looks like us, but he really is from another planet with powers we don't have. That's not Paul. But what helps us, rather than just making that distinction, is to say, well, why is he saying we do not lose heart? We are of good courage. Because he's bringing Timothy with him. Do you put Timothy on the same pedestal that you put Paul? Probably not. If you know something about Timothy, you know that he's timid at times. He doesn't write any books of the Bible. He's not the super apostle that we credit Paul with being. And so when Paul says, there are two of us in this battle, there are two of us enduring hardship, and we do not lose heart, suddenly it puts a relevance to it, a relatability to it that we might not otherwise have. You shouldn't dismiss Paul. You can't dismiss Timothy. So there's the caution. Don't let the enormity of Paul's suffering drive you to just say, okay, I've got nothing to complain about, and so I'll just slink away quietly. And don't let the incredible resilience that Paul showed as a man say, I can't relate to him, because he brings Timothy with him in the example in our text. So now, to the first question. What is going on that has Paul thinking, I bet the church at Corinth thinks I'm discouraged. I bet you they think I'm ready to throw in the towel. I bet you they think I'm done. What leads him to say, I better tell them I haven't lost heart? Now, the letter has overlapping answers to that question. We could jump where most of you probably expect we'll go, and we will go there eventually, to 2 Corinthians 11, where he just catalogs them for us and groups them together. We get a nice long list of his troubles. But I want to start at the beginning of the letter and just hit a couple of spots on the way, because I want you to see that trouble was not an occasional visitor to Paul's life. He speaks of it as it really was, as a constant companion. Paul always had troubles of various varieties. If you have your Bibles open, flip back to 2 Corinthians 1, verse 8 and 9, where we read, For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Now, Paul doesn't give a lot of specifics there. I don't know that scholars are of one mind about exactly what he's referring to there. You could try to pull some things together, maybe from Acts or other epistles, and say, oh, this was the event. But it really doesn't make much difference. Whatever the affliction was, wherever it occurred, it was of sufficient weight that Paul says, we thought we were going to die. We despaired of getting out of here alive. We just finished Philippians, and we saw that in Philippians as well, where Paul says, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get out of prison or not get out of prison, whether I'm going to live or whether I'm going to die. When Paul talks about life and death, he's serious. We've cheapened it, haven't we? That cheesecake is to die for. You laugh, and I understand why you laugh. It's okay. But you realize what we've done. We've taken one of the most serious realities that we live with day in and day out, and we've attached it to cheesecake or a movie or whatever. When Paul says the sentence of death was upon us, he was not running out of cheesecake. There was a sword pointed at him, and somebody with the power and the authority to make use of it. So that's one thing. They were always having the sentence of death hovering over them. In chapter 2, verse 4, we read, "For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you." Affliction, anguish of heart, tears. If you know the Corinthian church, you know that they're a mess. There are a lot of problems at Corinth. Paul loves these people, truly loves them. They are his children. What parent in here says, well, as long as I'm healthy, as long as nobody's beating me up, as long as there's no physical injury, I don't care what happens to my kids? No parent talks that way. Your child starts to walk away from the faith. Your child starts to wander into really destructive and false doctrine. And you're given a choice. You can let him go, or we can cut off your arm. You cut off your arm. And every parent in here knows that. That's what Paul is saying. Yes, he gets beaten up. But if you gave him the choice between, Paul, you want another beating? And if you get the beating, the Corinthians will come back to Christ, or you can stay safe and comfortable and they'll just wander. He'll say, give me the beating. So when he says, I wrote to you out of tears and out of anguish and out of affliction, that's weighty. In 2 Corinthians 2:12 we read, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was opened for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest, because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia. That's one of those texts we tend to read and just kind of skip over it. Don't skip over it. This is an apostle who says, pray for an open door. Pray that I can speak as I ought to speak. And so God gives him an open door. And he says, I walked right by. What causes him to do that? Well, he says, I didn't find Titus. How concerned do you have to be to walk away from your life's calling? He needed to find Titus. He needed to make sure he was okay. God, where is he? Is he arrested? Is he alive? Is he sick? What about the report that he's bringing with him from Corinth? I don't know how the church is doing. Until I find Titus, I have no rest. And that weighed on him so heavily, he said, I walked right by an open door for the gospel in the city of Troas. That's the kind of troubled spirit that would have had Paul in danger of losing heart. He references that season in his life again. In chapter 7, verse 5, he says, for even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. God comforts the downcast. The word translated downcast there, if you have a New American Standard, is translated depressed. God comforts the depressed. The words mean of lowly spirit and without hope. The man who writes to us that we should be anxious for nothing and rejoicing in all things just told you, I'm depressed. That's stunning. And I love it. Not because it gives me an excuse to be depressed or to remain depressed and to not battle that, but this Superman just took off the cloak, the cape, and stood next to me and said, I got depressed too. I needed God to be merciful to me too. I could not bear one more blow, psychologically, relationally. We were depressed. And now, we haven't mentioned anything physical yet. It's just been all the emotional, that sentence of death. I don't know where Titus is. But now we'll get to the physical. We'll skip ahead to chapter 11, beginning in verse 23, where Paul just puts this all together. To answer the question, church have a reason to be concerned for this man? The context of chapter 11 is he's responding to the accusations that he's not a very good apostle. False apostles have showed up. They've tried to undermine Paul, and they said, you should listen to us, not him. He does not like having to defend himself. He doesn't think he should have to defend himself, and in truth he shouldn't, but he does. And he says this, are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, in danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, throughout many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things. These are other things. He just gave you this incredible list of, those are other things. There's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? That's an amazing litany of affliction and pain. And that's why I opened the way I did to say, don't just compare yourself to that and say, okay, I have nothing to complain about. I'm just going to be quiet. Can't relate to Paul. Can't learn from Paul. No. Paul wants you to understand that he suffered so that the comfort he received is a comfort he can pass on to you as well. And I noted at the end, it's not just physical. It is emotional. It is spiritual. Apart from these other things, there's just daily pressure on me. Now, I'm not in a place to rank Paul's suffering among all saints. How does he compare to Job? I don't know. Not our job to rank them. But I trust that that's more than a sufficient list for you to say, well, if Paul can walk through that experience, those experiences that marked his life, and God can meet him in such a way that he can say, I am of good courage, and I do not lose heart, that maybe he has something to say to us. He put it all together for us in what Miata read in chapter 4, verse 8 and 9. He said, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Kind of off the charts for us, isn't it? Can you imagine having a missionary that we sent out and we began to get the emails back? I was in prison last week. They arrested me. They beat me for no reason other than preaching. They threw me in jail. Would you call them home? What if he said, the next week, they arrested me again, and they whipped me Would you call him home then? My guess is at some point this church, any church, might have a vote and say, we got to get this guy off the field, they're going to kill him. Because they probably are. And in Paul's case, they did. Paul's not going to let you drag him off the field. He endures this, and he endures it with good courage. And so we need to know why. The danger is real. The affliction is real. The pain is real. And he says, I don't lose heart. Timothy doesn't lose heart. We are of good courage, and we're pressing on. And given how comfortable we are and how foreign this is to us, we need to say how, why, what got Paul through this. And I want to give 3 fairly short answers to that question. All of them, I hope, encouraging. First thing is, they did not lose heart because they saw God's hand in those afflictions for their good. You know what the most discouraging thing in the world is? Pointless affliction. That it just has no purpose. But Scripture says if you love God and if you're called according to his purpose, there is no such thing, because all things work together for good. Well, Paul saw that. Paul lived that. We read in chapter 1, verse 6, if we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. We live in a broken world. Things are going to go wrong. Pain is going to be there. Loss is going to be there. It got broken in Genesis 3. It is not yet restored. Paul writes in Romans 8 that all creation groans. All of it groans. You, me, even we who have the Spirit, he says, groan within ourselves. Paul and Timothy are not shielded from this, but rather they get a double portion. Why? So that as God comforts them, they can comfort you. Paul saw a purpose in it. He gives a second good purpose for their suffering in verse 9. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us, hear the purpose? That was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Who's making them do that? God. God looks at Paul, he looks at Timothy, he sees them trusting in themselves, which we all do. He sees them holding on to false hopes, and he just pries their fingers loose. It hurts when he does that. Took the sentence of death. But Paul said, what a good impact it had, because I quit trusting in myself, but in God who raises the dead. Paul and Timothy don't ultimately need good news from Caesar, good news from Rome, that their life was spared. They need good news from God, that he has pardoned them, so that when they do die, of whatever cause and at whatever time, he'll raise them from the dead. And it took him putting the sentence of death upon them for them to say, we need to stop trusting in ourselves and in God who raises the dead. So that's the first answer to why they didn't lose heart. They saw God doing good things through their affliction. I hope you see God doing good things through your affliction. The second reason they did not lose heart and quit is because God never gave them more than they could bear. 2 Corinthians 7, 5 through 7, we read a portion of this, we'll read it again. For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without, fear within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced still more. God knows when you're at your limit. I think Paul and Timothy were at their limit. They needed Titus. They needed the good report. They needed the comfort. And God gave it to them. He did not give them more than they could bear. Psalm 103 says he knows our frame, and he remembers that we are but dust. He knows when the dust can't take any more. He knows when suffering ceases to be redemptive and begins to be destructive. And he will never let it be destructive for his people. Do you remember Philippians 2? Wasn't that long ago, Epaphroditus? He was sick to the point that it was uncertain if he would live. And here's what Paul wrote in response to that situation, Philippians 2:27. For indeed he was sick to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, so that we would not have sorrow upon sorrow. God knows when the sorrow is redemptive. He knows when it's edifying, and he knows when it's just sorrow upon sorrow that you don't need. He will not give you what you do not need. His wisdom is perfect. His love is perfect. And Paul and Timothy were learning to trust that God would never test them beyond what they could bear. So they did not lose heart because suffering had a purpose. They did not lose heart because God never brought them more than they could bear. And finally, they did not lose heart because they looked to and saw what cannot be seen with your eyes. And this is the frustration that I alluded to at the beginning. If there's one place I would want to camp and one place I would want to unpack, it's in the most impossible place in the text, where Paul says, I want you to know something that can't be known. Look again, chapter 4, verse 16, through the end of the chapter. So we do not lose heart. That's the main point, I would argue, of the chapter. It's why he begins that way. It's why he ends that way. In spite of all that's going on, we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul says it as clearly as it can be said at the beginning. We do not lose heart because our inner self is being renewed day by day. Now, in the context of 2 Corinthians, what we've been seeing and some of what we don't have time to look at this morning, I take this renewal of inner self to mean they're growing in their faith. God's purposes, God's goodness, their adoption, his love for them. No matter what happens externally, they know that they know that they know that God is for them and not against them. And they crave it and they love it and they relate to him increasingly with intimacy and with faith. That inner self is just being renewed day after day, even as their outer self is decaying for all the reasons that you can imagine. But there's something more here. That's glorious and that's wonderful and that will sustain you. But there's something more here. Because it's not just the good things that were happening in the near term, that renewal of the inner self. It's also what's happening long term, what's happening future. He focuses near the end of the passage on the promise of good things to come. Hear it again. He uses three contrasting terms. Verse 17. For this light, there's one term, momentary affliction, set that on one side, is preparing for us, not unrelated to, but is actually preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. Those are the three terms on the other side. They're meant to be contrasted. They're meant to be looked at. So now think with me just a minute what these terms mean in light of what Paul has just said and what we know about his afflictions. We spent a little time refreshing our memories of what you probably already know. Paul got beaten up a lot, carried a lot of weight, was always in danger of death, always feeling the pressure on the churches, always worried about false apostles, always worried that today was going to be his last day to be able to preach the gospel. So he lists all those, but I want to take a moment and just pick out one and have you enter in with me for a moment into just a little exercise of your imagination. while you remember that this is what Paul is describing as light, okay? In all that list of afflictions, the one that probably jumps out at us, makes us wince the most, is probably the 39 lashes. I've never seen anybody get whipped, never want to. It's a punishment designed to break a man, designed to make you scream, designed to make you say, whatever it takes not to have that happen again, I will do it, because I don't want that to happen again. But for our purposes, I don't want you to imagine Paul receiving it. You receive it. Let your hands be tied, stretched out, shirt taken off, and let the whip come down. Not once, not twice, but 39 times. Are you conscious when it's over? I don't know. Somebody's got to help you. Somebody's got to take you. Somebody's got to bandage your wounds. Over time, your back will heal. There'll be scar tissue. Over time, hopefully your spirit, your mind heals. And then it happens again. And then it happens a third time. And then it happens a fourth. And then it happens a fifth. And then we run off the end of the map of 2 Corinthians. We don't know if it happened again after that. Because it happened in response to Paul preaching, and he didn't quit preaching. It may well have happened a sixth or seventh time. We don't know. At that point, we can probably dispense with the fact that he was beaten with rods 3 times, shipwrecked, all the other things, because 195 lashes of the whip is probably about all the imagination any of us can handle on one morning. That's a heavy affliction. That's a pain that I suspect none of us in here can really relate to or want to be able to relate to. Now, take that affliction, as Paul says we should, put that on a scale. All that affliction, put it on a scale. Then take the glory that we will see one day and that we will be part of one day, because we will be transformed into that image of glory. It's not just what we see, it's what we become. Take that glory and put it on the other side of the scale. Now, how do they balance out? The agony, the scream, the pain of the 39 lashes, how does that balance out against seeing Christ and being made like him? Paul says this is light and this is heavy. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought, is there a place in your mind for a pleasure, a joy, an experience of delight that is so intense that it makes a whip as nothing? If I were to say that, I would be embarrassed. I would feel almost blasphemous, but Paul says it. Paul felt the whip, and Paul saw Christ. And he said, that's light, and this is glorious. He makes an almost identical claim in Romans. He says in Romans 8:18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Do you think that way? Is that how you walk through your week, with the troubles that come upon you? And I'm not mocking your troubles. Please hear that. There are real broken people in this room, broken in every way that you can conceive of. What keeps you hanging on? Do you just discipline yourself for a stiff upper lip? Is that what Paul would have you do? Or do you say, there is a glory coming. There is an experience coming There is a pleasure coming, a satisfaction coming, a finally coming home coming that puts all of this to shame. What seems so intense, so real, so painful, I will one day say, that was light. That was momentary. It's a hard thing to say this in some ways to a people. I know some of your stories that are getting bad news from family, bad news from doctors, bad news from your boss. All creation groans. We are no exception. Paul and Timothy groan, not just physically, but there's anxiety, there's being downcast, but they state as clearly as it can be stated, none of that's worthy to be compared. Stephen saw a glimpse of that in Acts 7 when the heavens were opened up. Isaiah had a glimpse of that in Isaiah 6. He saw a beauty so great that it frightened him. Have you ever thought about that? You need to, because it's what is designed to carry you through. There is a beauty, a glory beyond comparison so great that it scares God's people in this life. In the next life, it won't. But in this life, it will. It happened to John in Revelation 1. It happened to Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. The point being, the hope that one day you will behold a glory, a beauty, a pleasure, a joy that is so satisfying in the presence of the Lord that it will just wash away every pain, every affliction, every loss, is not the vain hope of a poet. It's the declaration of 2 Corinthians 4. A bit over 70 years ago, C.S. Lewis was asked to give a series of addresses on BBC Radio. One of the addresses he gave was entitled The Weight of Glory, with the address almost certainly coming from our text. Here's what he wrote, just one paragraph from it. With this I close. It is written, we shall stand before him, shall appear, shall be inspected. The promise of glory is the promise, almost incredible and only possible by the work of Christ, that some of us, that any of us who really chooses, shall actually survive that examination, shall find approval, shall please God. To please God, to be a real ingredient in the divine happiness, to be loved by God, not merely pitied, but delighted in, as an artist delights in his work, or a father in a son, it seems impossible. A weight or burden of glory which our thoughts can hardly sustain. But so it is. Pray with me. Father, this is where we need help. And this is where we depend on you to give us help, because we are such fleshly creatures. We are such creatures of the here and now. It would be an unusual person sitting before me that says, oh yes, I regularly go to that place in the Scriptures and that place in my mind where there is a pleasure so great, a beauty so great, a glory so indescribable that I not only observe but participate in, that it just swallows up the troubles of this world. We are consumed at times with the troubles of this world. And the word from the Scriptures today is not, oh, your troubles aren't real, or what's your problem. The word from the Scriptures is, there is a glory coming, a joy and a pleasure coming that will make these afflictions in your judgment, as well as in the judgment of Almighty God, be seen as light and momentary. There is an eternal weight of glory coming. I pray, Lord, that what cannot be compared in our text is in fact real to us. It will only happen by your Spirit, and we pray that it would. In Jesus' name.